Welcome to the FBS podcast, our deep dive into elementary forest sampling.
A classic.
You know, this book, it's kind of a refresher course.
Yeah.
For those of us, mid-career professionals who need a little brush up
Absolutely. It's perfect for that.
on these important sampling concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So this book, published way back in 1962 by Frank Freese.
Yep.
For the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service.
That's right. Really practical, field-tested approach.
And still relevant.
Definitely.
Today, really.
Oh, yeah.
And, right in the introduction,
Yeah.
Freese gives a shout-out to
He does. He does.
some pretty prominent statisticians.
Yeah.
So we know this book is built on a solid foundation.
Solid statistical foundation. Yeah.
So what can listeners expect from this deep dive?
Well, I think we'll cover those core sampling principles.
Right.
Why it's often the preferred choice over measuring absolutely every single tree.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
We'll look at some potential pitfalls
Oh, yeah, for sure.
that trip people up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in this idea that a well-designed sample could actually be more accurate
At times.
than a complete inventory.
Looks more accurate, potentially.
That sounds so counterintuitive.
I know, right?
Why would sampling just a portion
Yeah.
be better than measuring the whole
Yeah.
thing?
So think about it like this.
Okay.
You're a doctor
Okay.
or trying to make a diagnosis.
Right.
Do you analyze every single drop of blood?
No.
Or do you take a sample?
Yeah, you take a sample.
Right.
A blood sample is
Exactly. And it'd be pretty impossible to analyze every single drop, right?
absolutely impossible.
So it's all about efficiency, practicality. And in forestry, we're dealing with huge areas.
Massive.
Tons and tons of trees.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to measure every single tree in like a national forest.
Oh, that's a logistical nightmare.
Right. It would be a nightmare, a complete nightmare. So that's where sampling comes in.
Okay.
It lets us make these informed decisions about how to manage the forest
Right.
without having to actually measure every single thing.
But then how can we be sure that the sample we take actually represents
Great
the
question.
entire population?
It's all about careful design, those statistical principles.
Right.
Freese really emphasizes this, that even with a smaller sample size, we can get greater accuracy
Okay.
if we're careful and precise with our measurements. Our methods are sound, Yeah. Think of it like a skilled archer hitting that bullseye with just a few arrows, right?
Yeah.
Versus someone just randomly firing the whole quiver
Oh, yeah.
and just hoping for the best.
Spray and pray, right?
Exactly.
So, smaller, well-targeted sample.
Yeah.
More effective
Could be much more effective.
than a larger, more haphazard one.
Definitely.
And this leads us to some, I guess, fundamental concepts in forest sampling
Right.
that Freese really lays out.
Yeah.
Populations, parameters, and estimates.
Yep.
Defining your population of interest. It's so crucial.
Absolutely.
For example,
Yeah.
in a 250-acre forest tract,
Okay.
are we interested in the population of trees?
Yeah.
The plots within the tract?
Right.
Or even, like, the earthworms in the soil?
Absolutely.
I have to be so clear about what you're measuring before you even start.
Absolutely. It's that first step.
And then you need to choose a sampling unit
Right.
that really aligns with your population definition.
Yeah.
So we wanted to, estimate the total weight of earthworms in an area.
Okay.
It makes more sense to think in terms of, soil blocks
Right.
as our units, right?
Yes.
Rather than individual earthworms.
Absolutely. Simplifies everything.
It streamlines everything, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what about bias?
Oh, yeah.
Accuracy and precision.
They're important.
They're kind of thrown around a lot,
They are, kind of loosely sometimes.
but they have very specific meanings in the context of sampling.
Freese has this really great analogy.
Okay.
He uses the analogy of a target shooter.
Okay.
So an accurate shooter is consistently hitting the bullseye.
Sure.
A precise shooter might consistently hit the same spot off center.
Right.
Their shots are all clustered together,
Okay.
but not in the right place.
Got it.
So accuracy is hitting the mark.
Right.
Precision is about consistency.
Okay.
You can be precise, but not accurate.
Right.
And vice versa,
Got it.
And so this applies to forestry as well.
Okay.
So let's say you're using a caliper to measure tree diameters.
Oh, yeah.
but the caliper's misaligned.
Oh, okay.
You can make very precise measurements.
Right.
They're all going to be systematically off or biased.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So even if you're really careful, you can still have that bias.
You can.
If your tools are flawed.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, the key is awareness, you know?
Okay.
Be aware of potential sources of bias.
Right.
Consider their impact on your results.
Okay.
You know, sometimes bias is unavoidable.
Right, right.
And you have to weigh its impact against the cost of actually eliminating it.
Right.
So it's about being transparent.
Yeah.
Understanding the limitation.
Methods, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about different types of variables then.
Okay, yeah.
That we encounter in forest sampling.
Yeah, so we've got continuous variables like tree height or volume, things that you can measure along a scale.
Right, right.
And then we've got discrete variables, like seedling counts or categories like stalked versus non-stalked.
So continuous is like a spectrum. Discrete is like distinct categories. And understanding which type of variable you have will really influence your choices.
It will.
For sampling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're dealing with a continuous variable, like tree height, one of the most basic methods you can use is simple random sampling.
Simple random sampling, yep.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so imagine you have a 250-acre plantation.
Okay.
You want to estimate the average volume per acre.
Okay, yeah.
You could divide that plantation into 25 quarter-acre plots and randomly select a certain number of those plots to measure.
Got it.
That's the essence of simple random sampling.
You're randomly selecting a subset of the population.
Exactly.
To represent the whole.
To make inferences about the whole.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
So Freese goes through all the calculations, right?
He does, step by step.
He shows you how to get that estimated mean volume per plot.
Yep.
Standard error of the mean and the confidence limits.
Right. All important.
Now, confidence limits, remind me what those tell us.
So confidence limits give us a range within which we can be reasonably confident that the true population mean actually lies.
Okay.
So if our confidence limits are nice and narrow, we can be more confident.
Right. So the narrower the range, the more reliable our estimate is.
Exactly.
And sample size plays a big role in that.
Absolutely. Huge role.
The more plots you sample, the narrower your confidence limits will be.
Yep.
But, of course, more plots means more work, right?
That's always a balance.
Balancing effort and precision.
Effort versus precision, for sure.
Okay.
And Freese gives us guidance on figuring out that appropriate sample size based on, you know, how precise you want to be.
Right, right.
He also touches on the impact of plot size. Okay.
On variance.
Right.
Which can get a little tricky.
Yeah.
But it's an important concept.
Yeah. So simple random sampling, it's like a good starting point.
Yeah, it's a great starting point.
But are there methods
that are
more effective?
Oh, yeah, lots.
In certain situations.
Absolutely. Freese talks about stratified random sampling.
Okay.
Which is a technique that uses what you already know about the population to improve your precision.
So you're using your prior knowledge to your advantage.
Absolutely.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So imagine you have an 800-acre forest.
Okay.
And it's divided into 3 distinct types.
Okay.
You've got pine, bottomland hardwoods.
Okay.
And upland hardwoods.
Okay.
Right.
Got it.
So instead of just randomly sampling across the whole forest, you divide it into those 3 strata and sample each one separately.
Okay, so you're kind of breaking down the problem
into
smaller pieces.
You're getting a more refined picture, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
And by sampling each stratum and then combining the results, you can potentially get a much more precise estimate of the overall population mean.
Okay.
Plus, you get separate estimates for each stratum.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which can be super valuable.
Yeah.
For forest management.
Because sometimes you need those like finer grained insights.
Absolutely. Not just the big picture.
Right, right.
You need those little pieces.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about sampling with probability proportional to size?
Ah, yes, PPS sampling.
PPS sampling, yeah.
This is a really useful technique.
Okay.
When our sampling units are not all equal in size.
So if we're dealing with units of different sizes.
Exactly.
This method helps us account for that.
Absolutely. Imagine you're trying to estimate milling costs at different sawmills. With varying daily capacities. You wouldn't want to give a small mill the same weight as a massive industrial operation. So PPS sampling makes sure that those larger units are given their due weight in the estimate.
It's about making sure your sample reflects that true distribution.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this actually work?
Think of it like a lottery. Where you have more chances to win if you hold more tickets. So in PPS sampling, larger units are like holding more tickets. Giving them a higher probability of being selected.
Got it.
So it makes sense, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And then Freese takes us even further.
He does.
He introduces two-stage sampling.
Yes. Love two-stage sampling. It's a technique for when reaching individual sampling units is expensive or time-consuming.
Or both.
Or both, exactly. Think about sampling those remote forest blocks scattered across a vast landscape.
You can't just be going...
You can't just be...
all over the place.
Exactly.
To sample individual trees. So instead,
two-stage sampling...
You break it down.
Break it down into stages.
Yeah.
First, you select a sample of those primary units, like the forest blocks. And then you select a sample of secondary units, like the plots within each primary.
So you're basically creating a smaller, more manageable version.
Exactly.
Of the whole population.
Yes.
Got it.
And he walks us through, the calculations, how to estimate the mean, its standard error, using this two-stage approach. He even introduces the concept of optimum allocation. Which is about finding that right balance, between the number of primaries and secondaries to maximize precision while still keeping your costs in check.
So working smarter, not harder, right?
Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
That's what elementary forest sampling is all about, right?
It is, really emphasizing those practical implications. Giving clear guidelines.
We're actually implying it.
Yeah, in real-world forestry situations.
So we've covered a lot.
We have.
The basic whys of sampling.
Some
pretty sophisticated techniques.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, we're just getting started. Welcome back to the FBS podcast.
Glad to be back.
Last time, we were just starting to get into two-stage sampling. A really practical method when it's hard to reach your sampling units.
Yeah, like those remote forest blocks we talked about.
Exactly.
Seems like a real time saver out in the field.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And elementary forest sampling doesn't stop there. It goes on to look at even more tailored techniques. For example, what if those remote forest blocks you're sampling are dramatically different sizes?
Yeah, some are going to be huge.
Some
will be relatively small.
Exactly.
Ignoring those size differences seems like it would really mess up your results.
It could.
Especially if you end up sampling more of the smaller one.
Yeah.
Just by chance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where two-stage sampling with unequal size primaries comes in. Freese explains how to adjust your strategy to make sure those larger primaries have the right amount of weight in your estimates.
It's like making sure the bigger players have a voice at the table.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
It really highlights how this book gets into the nitty-gritty of actually applying these things.
Yeah, for real-world situations.
Yeah.
Speaking of practical techniques, the book also covers systematic sampling.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you establish like a regular pattern for selecting your sampling units.
Right. So instead of randomly choosing plots, you might lay out a grid and sample at regular intervals.
Got it.
Along those grid lines.
Yeah.
It can be super efficient.
Yeah.
Especially for large areas.
Sounds almost too simple.
I know, right? But
are there any downsides?
There can be.
Right.
Freese cautions against using systematic sampling.
Okay.
If there's any chance that your sampling grid might line up with some natural pattern in the forest.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So like if you were trying to sample wildflowers. And your grid lines happen to fall right between rows of flowers.
Oh, yeah.
You'd get a very skewed view.
Exactly.
Right.
You have to be aware of those pitfalls.
Right.
Make sure it's a good fit for your situation.
It's a reminder that even the simple methods require careful consideration.
They do.
So far, we've been talking about continuous variables.
Right.
Things like tree height, volume. What about categorical variables?
Oh, good point.
Where you're classifying things
Yes. Elementary forest sampling doesn't just focus on continuous variables. It also covers methods for those discrete categorical variables.
Right.
He starts with simple random sampling for classification data.
Okay.
Using the example of sampling a batch of seeds.
Okay.
To figure out what proportion are actually viable.
Right. So you're not measuring height or weight.
Right.
You're categorizing good or bad.
Exactly.
In this case.
Yep. And Freese walks you through how to calculate the estimated proportion, its standard error, those confidence limits we talked about.
Right.
He even gives you a handy table for looking up confidence limits for certain sample sizes.
It seems like he's really focused on making these things accessible, easy to apply.
He is very practical.
Yeah.
And then from there, he moves on to cluster sampling for attributes.
Okay.
This is a technique for when your units naturally occur in groups.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense in forestry. Like seedlings in a nursery bed.
Exactly.
They're not going to be evenly spread out. They tend to clump together.
Yeah. Freese uses an example of sampling oak seedlings in a forest to illustrate this.
Okay.
He shows you how to calculate the average number of seedlings per cluster, its standard error, and how to take into account the fact that clusters might be different sizes.
So even though you're dealing with categories, you're still taking those size differences into account.
Absolutely.
That's interesting.
He also introduces this cool trick.
Okay.
Transforming percentages.
Okay.
Which can make your estimates more reliable when you're dealing with certain types of data.
So he's giving you all these like tools, these different situations.
A whole toolbox. And he really emphasizes not just like blindly applying the formulas, but understanding the logic behind them.
Right, knowing when they might not be appropriate.
Exactly, the right tool for the job.
Right, and speaking of counting things.
Oh, yeah.
That leads to another interesting technique he covers.
Okay.
Sampling count variables.
Uh-huh.
This is when you're counting something that doesn't have a fixed upper limit.
Right.
Things like number of insects in a trap.
Yeah.
Birds in a flock, even seedlings per plot.
Right, those counts can get really high.
Theoretically, they could be infinite.
Right, exactly. And this type of data often follows different statistical distributions.
Yeah, making things a little more complex.
A little more complex, but Freese offers guidance on handling these count variables, including suggestions for like transforming the data to make it easier to work with.
So he's really trying to like equip choristers with the tools to deal with this messy data out in the field.
He doesn't just throw out abstract concepts.
Yeah.
He uses real-world examples, like sampling white pine cones, to estimate the average number of weevil larvae per cone.
Got it.
To illustrate how these techniques can actually be applied.
It's that connection between theory and actual practice.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
As we get towards the end of elementary forest sampling, Freese starts to look at the bigger picture of sampling design.
Okay.
He talks about things like the size and shape of your sampling units, how to estimate changes over time, and he gives this really useful framework for designing your own sampling surveys.
So it's like a blueprint.
It is.
For designing your plan from scratch.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he really emphasizes being clear about your objectives, what are you trying to measure, what data do you need. He even gets into like planning your data processing and analysis before you even go out in the field.
That's so important. It's so easy to get caught up in the field work.
I know.
And forget those essential steps.
Absolutely.
Right.
He also provides guidance on choosing between temporary and permanent plots. For estimating those changes over time. Remember how we talked about that correlation between those initial and final measurements? He shows you how to factor that in to your decision-making.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Elementary forest sampling really is a comprehensive guide packed with practical advice.
And valuable insights.
Yes.
I'm really impressed with how much this book covers.
Yeah, me too.
Seems like it'd be useful for, foresters at all levels.
With all stages of their career, for sure.
Yeah, I'm curious, though. Where do we go from here?
Well...
I mean, Freese's book, published in 1962. What about all the technological advancements?
That's a great question.
That have happened since then?
Yeah, that's something we'll touch on. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at how those advancements have influenced the way we do forest sampling today. And how they sort of complement those fundamental principles that Freese laid out.
It really is remarkable.
It is.
How relevant elementary forest sampling is.
I know.
Even after all these years.
Yeah, those principles are really enduring, you know?
It speaks to, like, the power of those fundamentals.
Yeah, Freese just did such a good job laying out that foundation, you know?
It stood the test of time.
It really has.
You know, going through this deep dive. It's like rediscovering a classic.
Yeah.
I'm already thinking about how I can apply these concepts.
That's great.
In my own work.
That's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It's not just about summarizing a book. It's about taking those nuggets and figuring out how they connect to your own experience.
Absolutely. And speaking of connecting the dots, you mentioned technology influencing forest sampling.
Right.
Since Freese's time. I'm curious to explore that further.
Okay.
We have all these tools now, like remote sensing, GIS, sophisticated software.
Yeah.
How have those advancements changed the game?
I think they've really expanded our capabilities, you know?
Yeah.
Allowed us to collect and analyze data on a scale that Freese probably couldn't have imagined back then.
Yeah, back in '62.
We can capture information about huge forest landscapes from above using satellites, aircraft.
Right.
It's like having a bird's eye view of the whole forest.
It is amazing to think about how much information we can get without even going out there.
I know.
But how do those technologies work alongside the traditional methods?
Well, it's not about replacing those traditional methods. It's about enhancing them.
Okay.
It's a partnership. So remote sensing and GIS can help us stratify our sampling, identify areas of interest, even pre-stratify our sampling efforts, leading to more efficient, targeted field work.
So it's like you're using technology to create a smarter sampling plan.
Exactly.
One that's informed by that broader perspective.
Exactly. And once you have that field data, you can use software to analyze it in ways that weren't possible before.
Right.
You can create maps, run models, even simulate different management scenarios.
That's amazing.
And see how they might impact the forest.
It's like we've gone from using hand-drawn maps and slide rules to these powerful digital tools.
I know. It's not just the tools, though. It's how we think about sampling. Technology's allowed us to go beyond just estimating. Like average tree height, volume. We can look at forest structure, biodiversity, even how forests are responding. To climate change.
We're moving from like a static snapshot to a more dynamic understanding of how it functions and changes.
Yes. Love that.
But with all these advancements, those fundamental principles that Freese emphasized,
they're still so important.
They're still important.
Yep, you still gotta
define your populations, choose your methods. Be aware of those biases.
Yes.
It's like a foundation, you know? Technology gives you fancier tools, materials.
Right.
But you still need that base. To create something that's both beautiful and functional.
I love that analogy,
As we wrap up our deep dive into elementary forest sampling, I'm struck by how this book has really been a springboard for so much innovation in forestry.
It's amazing.
It's a testament to clear thinking, careful observation, a commitment to understanding this complex world around us.
I love it.
So, to our listeners, whether you're a seasoned forestry professional or just starting out, we encourage you to revisit this text. You might be surprised by how much wisdom
you never know
you can find.
You'll find.
And who knows? Maybe you'll be inspired to develop the next groundbreaking sampling technique.
Absolutely.
That'll shape the future of forestry.
I love it.
That's a great thought to leave our listeners with.
Thanks
for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On this deep dive into elementary forest sampling.
It's been fun.
Until next time. Keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Keep learning.
Keep learning.
And keep those calipers calibrated.
Absolutely.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS podcast.